kinetic combat in Ukraine is reaching a culminating phase in the month of September. As we are aware, the rains will come after this and will create mud and slush and will make offensive operations very difficult, and that would be the end of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, at least for this season, this year. One of the prime lessons to emerge from the Russia-Ukraine war has been that with the current state of technology, with the total transparency of the battlefield due to satellites and drones, and the impact of heavy and medium artillery coupled with drones, the ability of drones to pick up, engage, destroy targets is now giving far greater power to the defensive over the offensive. There is a clear-cut, finding of this military campaign that the power of the defensive has far exceeded the power of the offensive. Any side that is attacking is likely to suffer very heavy losses and not be able to make proportionate gains. It is surprising that the Russians did make the gains that they did initially, but once the defense lines are frozen, the Russians have also learned the lesson that it is far easier to defend than it is to attack. That is why when the Russians mobilized 300,000 reservists last year, they opted to put the bulk of their forces on the defensive, right? Survokin, their general Survokin now created the Survokin line to defend all the occupied territory, Russian occupied territory in Ukraine, which is almost 1/5 of the Ukraine's territory. And he created the defense line in the typical Russian manner, 3-tiered, at places 5 to 6 tiers of defenses with very heavy minefields, kilometers deep of minefields, followed by anti-tank ditches, dragon teeth, and in the first layer they put the Spetsnaz fighters with anti-tank guided missiles, Spetsnaz fighters with night vision devices, with radio communications to call in the Kamov Ka-52 attack helicopters, call in the Su-24, Su-25 frog-foot ground attack jet fighters, as also vector in the artillery. And then behind them were the second tier, the third tier, and in places even more, 5 to 6 tiers of defenses. One of their new facets of this defensive battle was the rocket-delivered mines. Once the enemy cleared or the attacker cleared some lanes in the minefield, they were just able to fire rocket-delivered mines, which closed the gap behind the breaching parties and therefore created severe problem for the attacker. The Russians relied very heavily on their combat aviation now for a change, and like I said, the entire thing was modeled on the Battle of the Kursk salient in the Second World War in 1943. Please don't forget that was the time when both the sides, the Russians, the Germans, were poised to launch major offensives, and the Russians had opted to let the Germans attack first and use the power of the defensive to blunt the panzer formations, to inflict heavy losses on the panzer formations, and having blunted the German offensive, then go on their counteroffensive. That was the exact Russian plan. The Ukrainians had 9 new armored, brigades, mechanized brigades, airborne assault brigades, etc., which had been trained by the Americans and by NATO, and with the help of these, they hoped to make a breakthrough. Now, there were serious differences between the Americans and the Ukrainians about the design of this counteroffensive. As per the standard Russian policy, the Ukrainians spread the new NATO and American weaponry, primarily American weaponry, both in the eastern front at Bakhmut as also in the critical front in Zaporizhzhia in the south. The Americans were very keen that the Ukrainians focus their entire resources onto one sector to make a meaningful breakthrough. But as per the standard, Russian pattern, and because there were these jealousies, between competing Ukrainian commanders who were all hankering for a share of the pie of American and NATO weapons, and jealousies, mutual, whatever you have, to placate them, the former defense minister had opted to, spread the attack very thin. That means attack also towards Bakhmut, attack also towards Zaporizhzhia, and also in the south. The simple fact is that the Americans felt, spread the Ukrainian attacks very thin, and they could not launch meaningful attack or get meaningful gains in any given sector. Now, the simple fact is that the Ukrainians have now been forced by the Americans, one, to change their defense minister. As we are all aware, the Ukrainians have replaced their defense minister Reznikov with Rustam, Crimean Tartar. You see, and the fact is that Reznikov is being accused of pandering to the various formation commanders, as also of lot of corruption, etc. And we know the scandal in recruiting. So the Americans have had their way. They have forced a change of the defense minister of Ukraine, and they have also forced them to move troops from Bakhmut to the eastern front. And the Ukrainians have now massed forces to try and get a breakthrough at Robotino. As we are aware, they have succeeded in breaching the first Russian line of defense, and they are now trying to go in for the second line of defense there. The point at issue is, will the Ukrainians have adequate strength even in Robotino, even with additional forces, to try and break through the defense lines of the Russian second and third, and also deal with the Russian reserves? Because reports have come in that the Russians have also moved troops away from their offensive towards Kupiansk, and they have brought them to the south to deal with this new Ukrainian threat. Next factor is, like I said, the meteorological factor. How much time do the Ukrainians now have to try and break through? Do they have the strength to break through, and capitalize and go for the Azov sea coast, Melitopol and other targets on the sea coast? Very, very doubtful. The fact of the matter is that the Russians have primarily used the Kamov 52 helicopters, attack helicopters, firing the Vikhir missiles to deal with the mass of Ukrainian tanks. That is, the Leopards, 14 to 15 Leopards were destroyed, number of Bradley infantry combat vehicles, ICVs, have been destroyed. And when they started attacking in the mass as per NATO or American doctrine, they started with the troll tanks in front and convoys, bunched up convoys behind, which were easy targets for the Kamov 52 helicopters, firing Vikhir standoff missiles with a range of 7 to 10 kilometers, that is staying outside the range of the air defense resources of the Ukrainians. They were able to pick off and destroy the attacking Ukrainian tanks, especially the Challengers, especially the Leopards, were made mincemeat of. The Ukrainians were then forced to call off these mass tank attacks and to rely instead on infantry attacks on foot, hand breaching of the minefields and minor attacks. Now, these minor attacks can just gain a village here and there. They cannot make deep or meaningful penetrations. So that is the current state of the play in this particular battle. The other facet is, which is different from heretofore, and lessons to be learnt for military analysts and armed forces all over the world. The Ukrainians, under American advice, have relied very heavily on counter battery fire, because they realized that the primary disruptors of their offensive, their attacks, was the Russian heavy and medium artillery. So with their drones, with their satellites, with their HIMARS, they have focused very heavily on attacking the counter battery fires, on attacking, targeting the Russian artillery, and the damage inflicted upon the Russian artillery has been, the Ukrainians claim, 10 times higher than in the previous offensives. And with this, they thought they would be totally able to stymie the Russian defensive tactic of using a combination of drones and artillery to defeat any attack. So what happens thereafter? The rains come in. As it is, the Ukrainian offensive had to be delayed in between. The rains come in and the Ukrainians cannot then pursue their so-called delayed spring to summer offensive because of the meteorological factors. Next will come in the phase of winter. Now the Russian plan was to destroy these, the newly raised 10th Corps and the 25th Corps of the Ukrainians, which were launching this counter-offensive with the 9 brigades newly created, with a mass of American and NATO equipment given, primarily based upon the Leopard, Challenger tanks, Bradley armored fighting vehicles, Swedish armored fighting vehicles, etc. The Americans had given 2 million rounds of 155 millimeter guns, howitzers, for the bombardment. But the rate at which the Ukrainians have been using up these artillery ammunition, the Americans are finding it very difficult to keep pace. Their production capability is 7,000 rounds a month. They are firing almost 7 to 10,000 rounds a day. Of course, the Europeans have also stepped in to try and produce 155 millimeter ammunition and keep the Ukrainians supplied. The Russian plan was to absorb the Ukrainian attacks, stymie it, destroy, impose heavy attrition on the Ukrainian armored mechanized formations, and then go in for their counter-offensive. They had launched this counter-offensive already in the Kharkiv sector, where they claimed to have captured Kupiansk, which was taken by the Ukrainians, wrested back last year in September. They have recaptured it, but now they have been forced to pull back some number of their forces to deal with the emerging situation at Robotino. So, President Putin has clearly claimed that the Ukrainian counter-offensive has failed. So, let's make an assessment then, a military assessment. The counter-offensive, I would tend to agree with the Russians, has failed to make any major substantial gains, except for minor gains in Robotino and on the Bakhmut sector. On the flanks of Bakhmut, not really very pertinent in terms of major gains. About 100 kilometers of area for about 3 months of fighting is not at all very impressive. The Americans and the NATO allies are now, bickering against the Ukrainians. There has been a lot of bickering between the two sides. They have gone to the press, and the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have all been highly critical of the Ukrainians. Could the Ukrainians have done better? Could any other army have done better? I am afraid not. Even if the American army had been fighting, they would have come up with the same results, unless there was massive air power to support this particular offensive. Now, even there is a question mark. We have seen that even the Russian Air Force, one of the very, very technologically superior air forces of the world, has not been able to do much because of the density and lethality of the air defenses, S-300, S-400s, S-500s, also the Patriots, also the Manpads, and so many other weapon systems that have been introduced into the battlefield have made direct air attacks very difficult. The Russian Air Force has also been now confined to standoff attacks from well off using cruise missiles and the others. And even the Ukrainian Air Force, whatever little successes it has with the Storm Shadow and the other cruise missiles, even the French cruise missile, has been attacking from standoff distances to stay away from the very lethal air defense cover that is now available over the battlefield. Now there is talk of the F-16s. Now the NATO is likely to provide about 44 F-16 jet fighters to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian pilots are under training. F-16s likely to be available earliest by next year beginning, or most probably spring or summer offensives next year they'll be available. The Ukrainian pilots are being trained. It is not just pilots that have to be trained, the maintenance staff. Of course, the maintenance staff can be American, like they have been doing. So that, I suppose, could be overcome. But the fact is that the F-16 is a third generation fighter. And it cannot do wonders where fifth generation fighters not so much employed by the Su-57 has not been much seen, but 4.5 generation fighters like the Su-35 etc. have failed to make much of a difference. So I am not very convinced as to how much of a game changer the F-16s would be. Every now and then we hear this is the silver bullet, this one particular weapon system will defeat the Russians totally. It was the TOW anti-tank guided missile, the Stinger missiles first, then it was the HIMARS, then it came to be the drones, and then the Storm Shadow, etc., etc. Every now and then we were told the Leopard 2 would be the game changer system. I mean, all these I don't think there is any magic silver bullet. It will have to be a combination of various weapon systems acting like a well-oiled orchestra. But the simple fact is that the power of the defensive has gained a substantial edge over any offensives that you can do. So what next? Now the winter comes. Last year in winter the Russians had tried 4 to 5 different offensives, but they had not made any major headway in the winter, and that is why the Suvarnakin line was created. When they mobilized 300,000 reservists, there was talk that they would mobilize much more. Please bear in mind that the Russian population at the time of the Second World War was less than what it is now. It was about 100 million. It is now 140 million. So the simple fact is, how is it that they were able to mobilize such huge formations, second, third echelon, operational maneuver groups, hundreds of divisions, Russian divisions were raised then. Why can't they now mobilize further and finish this battle once and for all? Why are they doing it in increments? The simple fact is, one, that the demographic profile of the Russian population was far younger. In the Second World War, they could recruit far more number of troops than they can do now. Now it is an aging population, number one. Number two is politically, I mean, that level of Stalinistic control over the population is just not there. And then Mother Russia was under invasion. It was a do or die battle as far as the Russians were concerned. Now they are fighting in another country, though the Russian attempt has been to paint it as a battle of survival to their own population. And try and whip up the same patriotic fervor and nationalistic feelings. But the fact of the matter is, they have not been able to mobilize so far more than 300,000. Out of the 300,000, about more than 200,000 has gone into the defense line, the Suvarnakin defense line that has been created. It has been very, very effective. But how long can you achieve permanent results by just the defensive? At a point in time, you have to transit to the offensive, and that was the Russian plan. The Russian plan, like I said, was stymied by the fact that the Ukrainians did not commit. They called off their attacks halfway, and then they started using infantry attacks. That means they kept their armor in reserve. They did not commit their reserves as the Russians had hoped they would, and the Russians had hoped to destroy these reserves or to substantially attrit them, so that then they could switch on to the counteroffensive. That is the Russian dilemma. If they switch on to the counteroffensive now in winter, a large part of these Ukrainian reserves, or a fair part, I would not say large part, a fair part of the Ukrainian tank reserves, mechanized reserves are still intact because they have not been committed. Wisely the Ukrainians called it off. Wisely the Ukrainians held back. The Americans have been denigrating the Ukrainians, the NATO, that they are casualty averse. I mean, that is rich coming from the Americans and the Ukrainian and the NATO forces, which have been very risk averse in Iraq and in Afghanistan. The difference there was that there was hardly any opposition in terms of air defenses, in terms of air force that could even come anywhere close. So the Iraqi air force was wiped out. Then there was almost 40-day long air offensive to pound the Ukrainian, the Iraqi armed forces, and then they had gone in. What was the level of armored, mechanized, or air defense or air opposition in Afghanistan? Nix, zilch. So, I mean, you could sort of, even there they were cautious, because they are the people who are quite risk averse. Quite obviously, casualties have huge political costs in the United States and in Europe. So it is rich that the Americans are calling the Ukrainians casualty averse. The Ukrainians have suffered hell of a lot. Their population base is not such as can enable them to continue this for very long. They have been forced now to pick teenagers from the streets. That is why the recruiting staff had to be thrown out, because this is proving highly unpopular. Now they are thinking of using women to give a break to the men. So that shows the dire straits that the Ukrainians are in. I mean, the Americans and the NATO might think that they can keep pumping in weapons to make to fight the Russians till the last Ukrainian. The last Ukrainian, you're almost reaching there. You're almost reaching the last Ukrainian. So now an American strategy, a NATO strategy, is to drag the war on to the next year, to the year after that, in the hope that it will finally torpedo the Russian economy. So far, the Russian economy is showing no signs of collapse. In fact, they have said their GDP rate of growth will be 1.8%. So it's not going into any negative tailspin or negative rates of growth like it had gone in 1991. When the Soviet Union had collapsed economically. We don't see that economic collapse coming. So the American hope is that every year they'll send in a new tranche of weapons and keep the Ukrainians now banging their heads against the Surovikin line, against the Russian defense lines in the Ukraine, and keep trying offensives in the hope that ultimately somewhere they'll make a breakthrough and succeed. For that you need manpower. You may be able to keep supplying weapons and weapons and weapons. I'm afraid unless the United States and NATO decide to put boots on the ground, I don't see the manpower equation being reversed. Even the Russians are not mobilizing. I think they may be forced to mobilize. If this continues, they may be forced to mobilize more. Quite obviously, this mobilization doesn't seem to be very popular in Russia, and it appears that also had led to a share of political problems. So there is also an upper limit on how much the Russians can mobilize, but if forced they can do, they will have to do more of mobilization. Without that, I don't see any conclusion to this conflict that can at least be lasting for a few years. The point at issue is the manpower equation is badly skewed against the Ukrainians. The Russians are still better off with a larger population base, however aging, however demographically skewed, but they are still better off because the same demographic constraints also affect the Ukrainians. There is not much difference. The simple fact is that the Ukrainians are reaching that stage of the Americans want to fight the Russians to the last Ukrainian. The last Ukrainian is now almost there. They are now planning to mobilize their women. So that shows the kind of dire straits that Ukraine is in. Whether this war can be continued as the Americans want forever and ever and ever, how long will the support last in a year of election in the United States, and with economic woes mounting in Europe? Germany has suffered the most, France, United Kingdom, I mean all these countries have suffered because of this war. The world has suffered because of this war. And how long the entire world can sit back and take it on the chin remains to be seen. But for the time being, President Biden seems determined to try and pursue this offensive for as long as possible in the hope that the Russian economy will collapse. That seems to be a chimerical hope, because economic analysts tell us that the Russian economy is not collapsing. It can continue this. It can go on with this. It can bear this and continue. They have switched to a wartime economic mode. Their production of artillery ammunition, production of missiles and drones is continuing unabated. The North Koreans may also start supplying. China may also start supplying. China may open a second front in Taiwan. Maybe next year, maybe the year after that, and that will make a serious material difference to the whole equation. So I don't see the NATO and the American strategy of continuing this war for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years really succeeding, because of the simple fact that the Ukrainian manpower equation has reached a very, very dangerous situation. Unless NATO and America are prepared to put boots on the ground, I don't think we can continue this very further. That will be good for the world. We were all hoping that in September a kind of stasis would have reached where both sides would be in a mood for negotiation. I'm afraid the Americans and the NATO have stymied any chance of negotiations by their insistence on Ukraine that it continue the fighting to the last Ukrainian if required. So whatever hopes we had of that have gone for a toss. There were hope in India that India would be able to negotiate a kind of a ceasefire and in situ a kind of a peace talks, commencement of peace talks at the G20 summit. It's all been torpedoed because Putin is not coming, because Xi Jinping is not coming. So whatever hopes we had of that are now zilch. The fighting for this season may taper off. Maybe the Russian counteroffensive in winter may cause some material change, but there is likelihood that it may be continued next year if the Ukrainian can afford it manpower wise. Thank you.